So it's kind of growing up in my journey to wanting to be a writer, and then I can kind of go into publishing after that. So for me, it really started with movies. Like when I was like my son's age, he's here, he's 10. He didn't have school today, so he got to come hang out with me. When I was about his age, my parents really didn't have a high bar for like watching what I watched. I could watch anything I wanted, really. So we were watching a lot of like action movies, like Face Off, or stuff like any Van Damme movie. That was like our Friday night movie. We would watch a lot of Van Damme movies, a lot of violent movies. My dad would take me to the theater all the time, and that was kind of our thing. So we would go see movies. And it was through watching so many movies that I came to love storytelling. And from that, I kind of started realizing how stories worked. And I mean, most movies, like if you go see any mainstream movie, it's heavily plotted. So it's like a lot less in character, especially the movies I was watching at the time, because I was watching a lot of blockbusters. So just heavily plotted movies, and they're very formulaic. So you can almost see the writing on the screen as you're watching these kind of things. And it was only a matter of time before my love of movies kind of shifted into me wanting to make movies. So like as a young man, that's really what I wanted to do, is make movies, not necessarily write books or anything like that. I wanted to tell stories still, yes, but through the lens of an actual camera and projected onto a screen. And let's see, at the time, my favorite filmmaker was Steven Spielberg. And he's like the master of the blockbuster. So I think going to see all of his movies, you could definitely see that thread of the stories he wanted to tell and kind of what worked and what didn't. And I think what it kind of boils down to for me at that time was entertainment. Like I was going to see these things to be entertained. And so in 5th grade, I was heavily into these movies and stuff. And then that's when I got my first Stephen King book. And it was The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. So I read this book, and Stephen King, like Steven Spielberg, is heavy on entertainment. Like he just wants to entertain people and tell a good story and kind of scare you a little bit, right? He wants to scare you. So like in Stephen King, I kind of found this love of story in books as well as movies. And then at this point, like 5th, 6th grade, my parents got their first video camera. So I started taking this video camera and trying to make my own little movies. But I didn't have any like editing equipment. So it was just like starting it, I would have a friend say a line, then I would stop it. And then we would shift the camera angle, start it again. I would say my line, we would stop it. And that's kind of where it started, is making these little movies. I started realizing like I can write scripts and I can write stories and dialogue that kind of all informs what I'm doing with these. And around the same time, because of my love of Steven Spielberg, I tried to remake Saving Private Ryan, or like the Omaha Beach scene, the opening scene. I tried to remake that, and we shot off some fireworks, and I got shot in the face with a BB gun. So my parents promptly stopped my investigation into trying to make movies, especially war movies. But even then, I kept watching them and I kept writing, and that's kind of where it started for me. Is I would write these scripts, and the scripts were terrible, and they were all just derivative and just taking from other things that I'd already seen. But I really liked doing it, and I feel like the more I did it, the more I was kind of sharpening and honing that skill. Right around the same time, a teacher of mine, we did this prompt where it was they gave us the first sentence of a story, and then every kid was supposed to take that first sentence and then write their own like 500-word story. And it was really wild to see how different every story was in the class. And I took it home and I had my mom read it, and she like busted a gut laughing. Like she thought it was so funny, and I was just like, oh, like I did it. Like I wrote something that entertained somebody. So that night, we had like a family dinner. Like my aunts came over, my uncles, and I spent the whole night running in, and I was writing these like page-long stories, and then running out. And little did I know they were all just hammered. They were just drinking all night. So they were really enjoying my stories. But even then, I was just like, I'm killing it with these. So I ended up taking all those stories and I stapled them into this book, and I put cardboard in it. And I made this like hardback version. It was called Short Stories for Short People because I was a kid. And I still have it. My son actually was just reading it last week. And it's just kind of a fun keepsake of like, that's kind of where it started for me. And from there, I just continued writing stories and continued writing scripts mostly. And I was trying to make them longer and longer and longer because a feature-length script is generally between 90 and 120 pages. So that's always kind of what I was chasing. Like I would often write scripts that ended up being like 40 pages. And like, while it was fun and like informative, I felt kind of like I failed. So it's always trying to write to 120. And I think in high school I wrote one that was like 110. And I felt really proud of it. And again, terrible. But I told the whole story, and the whole story took the length of a feature-length movie, or what it would have been. So then while I was in school, didn't read as much, or in high school, I didn't read as much. I was still watching a ton of film. And a friend of mine was just like, do you want to go see Chuck Palahniuk, who's reading down at Auntie's? This is back when Auntie's used, I think, all 3 floors, which was like a wondrous time. I wish we could go back to that. But I had no idea who this guy was. And it turns out he was the author of Fight Club. So he came, because he lives in Vancouver, Washington, so he came up to read. I went and saw it, and it was the grossest, gnarliest reading I've ever been to. Like, the story he read was just disgusting. And I'd never heard anything like it. And I was like, this can be a book? Like, this story? So I immediately bought a couple of his books and hailed them, picked up another Stephen King book, and that's kind of what got me reading again. So this really gross story, I think it's about this guy, his guts, like, come out of his butt or something. It's called Guts. And that's what kicked off my reading again. And right around the same time, I discovered Quentin Tarantino, which again, like, very intense and over the top, much like Chuck Palahniuk in a slightly different way. So I started going into these like more subversive realms of writing and storytelling. And at that point, with Quentin Tarantino, because he's an independent filmmaker who started out that way, it opened this whole other door into independent cinema. So in my head before, I wanted to go to film school, but I thought you had to have like tens of thousands of dollars, and go down to California, go to film school, go through all 4 years, and then get into the studio system and yada, yada, yada. But when I discovered independent film, it felt like much more accessible to me. Like, there's filmmakers who made movies for $5,000, and they got like theatrical releases and stuff. So it just felt like it was more in my grasp at that point. And it didn't feel like they were necessarily movies or stories for the mainstream, which kind of opened up my worldview as well and kind of informed what I could write and kind of the different approaches and venues I could go down. Let's see. So yeah, at this point, laptops were more accessible, YouTube was more of a thing, so I continued making little short movies with my friends and stuff, but I was getting pretty close to going to college, so that's kind of where I had to make my decision. Like, do I want to go all in and go down to California for film school, or do I want to find something here? And that's when I got accepted into the Seattle Art Institute for Film, and I thought, like, nailed it, I'm going to do it. But then I talked to some friends, and they dissuaded me and kind of discouraged me. And they essentially said, if you're going to go to school for film, you want to do it in California or New York, where you're close to filmmakers. And it was discouraging. I think in retrospect, I kind of wish I would have gone to Seattle to do it, because there's a lot of different ways you can get into that industry. But it kind of kicked me back to that independent line of thinking of, like, instead of spending a bunch of money to go to California and go to film school, I should just take that money and try to make a movie here. So that's when I kicked into overdrive and started writing a bunch of scripts. And me and a friend of mine, we were just trying to find the story that we could tell, that we could film here, and just go for it. Which, spoiler, never happened. uh, because I went to the Spokane Falls. And while I was there, I was just planning on doing my first two years, get my AA, and then go on to a 4-year degree to get, or 4-year college to get something that would make me money, I guess, like something sensible. So right toward the end of my 2 years, I started thinking, like, okay, like what sensible, logical degree should I get? And then the poet Saul Williams came to speak. I don't know if any of you guys know Saul Williams. He's a slam poet, and he's also, like, he makes music as well. But just a brilliant, brilliant writer. And it was weird because it was that, like, just that same time when I was thinking of, like, what I needed to do going forward. I went and saw him speak, and he was so charming and engaging. And somebody asked him, like, what do you, like, if you really want to write, but you don't think you can make a career out of it, what should you do? And his response is basically, like, go for it. Like, you have to follow what you love. You got to do what you love, and everything else will come out in the wash. And it felt like he was almost speaking right to me, because it's exactly what I was thinking. Because I was considering going to Eastern for their undergraduate creative writing program. So once he said that, I was just like, done deal. So I went to Eastern. I worked under Sam Ligon, Rachel Tour, Natalie Cush. I don't know if any of them are still there, but they're all really just brilliant teachers and really great writers. So I went there, and that's where every week, so there was one quarter where every week I was reading 3 novels a week, but I was a projectionist at the time, so I did all of my homework up in the projection booth, and I never did homework at home. So I was writing, reading, all of that while I was working, which is a blessing, now that I look back on it. And yeah, so that's where, like Stephen King says, if you want to be a writer, you have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. So those 2 years at Eastern, I was reading a ton and I was writing a ton. And it just kind of carried over. I feel like I got that momentum. So when I graduated, I noticed a lot of my co-students, a lot of them just stopped writing and stopped pursuing any sort of like artistic life. But I feel like I still had that momentum, so I kept going for it, kept going, kept writing, and right before I graduated, I had the first draft of Learn to Swim. So what Learn to Swim, how that came about is one of my best friends growing up, he died when we were 20, and I didn't really know what to do with all the emotions as a 20-year-old who's trying to like deal with death. And I kept kind of getting these lightning flash moments where I would remember a moment that we had or that we shared. So I'd grab just a scrap of paper and I would jot down that memory. And I would write down, they're all vignettes. So that book is just built up of almost like floating vignettes. So it's kind of a mosaic novel or novella in a way. So over the course of 3 months, I was just writing down these memories on this scrap of paper. And then I compiled it somewhat like in chronological order. And I went to Rachel Tour and I was like, hey, I have this book. What do I do with it? Because I didn't know. Because right at the end of that, right at the end of my degree, I asked, I was like, what do we do with this degree? Like the Saul Williams thing fueled me through the entire time at Eastern. And then right at the end, that logical side of me kind of kicked back in saying like, what are you going to do with this degree that you just spent 4 years on? So I asked and she was like, oh. And I was like, that's not a great response, I don't think, but that's okay. So I asked her, I go, what do I do with this? And she goes, well, it's only 13,000 words. There's no proper names in it, because that's why it's experimental, is I took all proper names out. So if you ever see an occurrence of he, him, or his, it's speaking very specifically to my friend who passed away. And everybody else just has a physical attribute. So it's like my friend with glasses said this, and then he walked into the room. So that's why it's experimental, but also a memoir. And essentially she said, you're going to have to go the small press route if you want to get this published, unless you want to do like a whole overhaul and try to add 40,000 words to it or something like that. So instead of doing the overhaul, I just threw myself into like this small press world of books, which is nice because we're so close to Portland. Portland just has like countless small presses. and like the Portland Book Festival was like a really wonderful event. It's like Get Lit, if Get Lit was in one location over the course of 6 hours. And they just get these huge, huge names. So I started meeting more writers, talking to more writers. I started sending stories out at this point too, and just getting the rejections coming back just in droves. I don't think I got my first acceptance until I was 2 or 3 years out of college. So yeah, I just started sending Learn to Swim around, and University of Hell Press, which is a press in Portland, picked it up because I read one of their books. It felt like it was like a cousin to Learn to Swim because it was told in these vignettes in the same way that Learn to Swim was. So I sent it to them, and I sent a hard copy. I was very much in this like mindset of like, you print your story or your book out and you put it in a manila envelope and you send it along. And I didn't know until like 2 years after they published it that so the guy who runs Hell Press, his name's Greg, he was introducing me, and he told this story about how he had his address on their website just in case. And he said one day this manila envelope showed up, and it was the only one he had ever gotten. Everybody else was smart and just emailed it to him. But he cracked it open, and like, I think it worked. I think I tricked him, is what happened. So yeah, so I published that, and in my head, the moment that I got like that first thing published, I thought everything else was going to be easy. Like I thought I was going to write these short stories, send them out, and they'd be like, "Oh, you had this book published through Hell Press. Of course we'll take this." Like that wasn't the case. It was just just tons of rejections again and again. 2 years ago, I challenged myself to get 100 rejections. So I kept sending out poems and stories and essays, and while I got it, I think I got rejected 103 times, but it was the year that I had the most acceptances also. Like I think I had like 5, so maybe not a huge, like a major ratio, but like it was enough. So I think it's that persistence of like just continually trying, because it can be discouraging, you know. But yeah, so in the aftermath of Learn to Swim, I ended up writing 2 additional books. So I wrote a novel that took about 6 months, and it was more of a standard. It's more of a standard schedule for me. I would wake up at 5 a.m. and I would write until about 8 or 9, and then I would go to work. And I did that every day for 5 or 6 months, and that's like a beefy 90,000 word novel. And then a couple years later, I actually have a new book that just came out in September. It's called Bardo. And that one, my wife would go over to Olympia to work during the legislative session. So it was just me and Abe, and he was 3 at the time. So I would wake up again at 5. I would write from 5 until whenever he woke up. And then we would do our single parenting child thing, just go to the library, do the story time, go to the park, all of that. And when he went to bed around 7, I would write from 7 to midnight. And I did that for a week. So I wrote the first draft in a week on that. And I feel like the major works that I've written, I've written them all differently. Like I'm working on a novella right now, and it's just like trying to steal 20 minutes at a time to jot down a section. Because I'm doing kind of the short vignette style approach to it again. And I think the reason why is because I think you need to adapt to what your life allows you to do. Like I'm not going to stop writing, but I'm not going to be able to wake up at 5 and write, because he has a brother too, so we have 2 kids. I work a full-time job, so it's hard. So it's just finding ways to adapt to the life that I've made for myself while still being able to write. And I think that's kind of a little bit about my process, and just a lot about talking about movies, I suppose. But did you guys have any questions?
Actually, yeah. So when you got out of Eastern, and you said you kind of looked around like, oh, what do I do with this now? if you had to go back and do it again, would you still get your degree, or would you just kind of say, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead?
I would.
You would?
But I think the reason why, a big part for me at least, is my day job is I'm a copywriter for an advertising agency.
Okay.
So if I didn't have my creative writing degree, I never would have gotten that job. And it's like the best job I've ever had. But even then, I think yes. Because I think I could have found something else that would have paid the bills. And just the experience of working with somebody like Sam Lagan or Rachel Tour and just like really honing that craft, I think it was worth it. So I think I would probably go for it again, even if I didn't have the job I have now.
Who is your favorite prof?
Sam.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lagan is awesome.
He's it's the first time I've heard. It was the first time I heard a professor swear as much as he does, and like the story. Apologies, because I'm about to swear. But the story I remember is he was talking about titles and how much weight a title can carry, and he said like, what is Hemingway's title? The Sun Also Rises. What does that tell us? And everybody's just like hemming and hawing. And nobody really had an answer. And he finally just looked around and he goes, that the motherfucking sun also sets! So it's just like, okay. Like, I get it now. I'm always going to remember that. So yeah, I mean, a title is almost like just an encapsulation. Like almost like a very short poem that's supposed to not necessarily tell the whole story, but reflect what the story's about, right? So.
If you were ever given a shot at doing a movie, would you try it?
Oh, yeah. It would be terrible, I think. But yeah, of course I would.
You mentioned Stephen King. Do you have a genre, something that you prefer writing in as?
When I went through school, I was like, I called myself a fiction writer. I told everybody I write fiction. But I think I'm best at nonfiction and like memoir. Because like the essay you mentioned in your intro, A Convenient Fiction, that's an essay that's taking a very real moment from my life and kind of bringing almost a scientific thing to it. I was listening to a lot of Radiolab and Invisibilia when I wrote that essay. So I feel most comfortable with that. Like I think fiction's harder. Like nonfiction might be take an emotional toll because you have to relive a lot of stuff and try to like put yourself back into that mindset. But like you gotta like think of everything with fiction, and like I don't think I'm that smart or like I don't know. But the new book is fiction, so I'd say I try to kind of be someone who does all of it. Like I wrote a horror novel, and then the memoir is completely different, and this new novella that I have is a crime story. So I don't know. I want to entertain above all else.
The entertainment factor.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that your education helped you in your copywriting job, and if so, how?
I think so, because I think the education was very much like you need to like sit down in the seat and do the work every day. Like to be like an artist, like all the creative stuff that I write, like I don't have that schedule. It's very much like working off of inspiration. It'd be easier if I actually sat down and wrote every day. But I think that's kind of what the education taught with the copywriting thing, because I'm working on deadlines.
Yeah.
So if I'm sitting down and something's due in 4 hours, I can't be like, I'm going to wait until I'm inspired. Like, it's just like, I got to write something. And oftentimes, it's just getting started, and I'll quickly come to something better. Like, it's just starting. And I think that's what going to school for, I think it really sharpened and honed that. It's like, you just need to start.
So your copywriting is actually sharpening and honing your writing abilities too.
I do think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when I have downtime, I like take grammar courses, which I used to be terrible
That's
at.
good. That's
Yeah.
good.
Are you still reading in between?
Oh yeah, I think I read more than I write, which I want to find a balance between that. I've also started doing audiobooks this year, which is fun. I never really listened to audiobooks before.
Oh,
So I've done a lot of, read a lot of books this year. partly because of that. So we got a dog. So now when I walk the dog, I listen to books.
So this is the month of NaNoWriMo. Have you ever done? Will you ever do it?
I've never done it. I would like to. I think at this point, the kid, like Abe is 10, his younger brother's 6. So I think they're old enough to where I could feasibly pull it off and like find the time. It's not like I'm waking up in the middle of the night, like taking care of babies and changing diapers anymore. So I've never done it, but I would like to try it sometime.
Cool.
We didn't hear what she asked you. Try what?
Oh, NaNoWriMo? So it's every month of November, the challenge is to write a 50,000 word book, right?
Mm-hmm.
So check, you just have the 30 day or 30, I don't even know how many days are in the month.
30.
30, okay, you have the 30 days to write a 50,000 word novel.
It's about 1,760 some words, I think, a day.
It's insane. That's
Not
like,
really.
well, I mean, you hear about Stephen King. Like, Stephen King's writing schedule is he writes 10,000 words every day, which is just wild to me. But it also makes sense that he comes out with a novel every year, right?
A novel big enough to choke a horse on.
Yeah. Yeah, it was Nicholas Sparks. In college, somebody found Nicholas Sparks' like writing blog, and his suggestion was shoot for 2,000 words a day. And that's what I did with the novel that took me like 6 months. I was shooting for between like 1,500 and 2,000 words a day. And it worked really well. Like I completed the book in like a handful of months. But then to read that Stephen King's doing 10,000 words every day, like it just blew my mind. I can't imagine.
Doesn't Stephen King, though, work 7 days a week, like 12 hours a day or something?
He's got it.
Yeah, I think I read something like that.
Yeah, it's got to be something like that. Maybe he slowed down a little bit since
In
then.
his memoir, he said it's 8 hours a day.
Is it 8 hours?
Every single day. You have no life.
Writing is life.
Well, if you work at a job 8 hours a day, you know.
Right, I think.
No, I'm saying Saturday and Sunday, too.
Oh,
You know,
7 days a week.
yeah, you gotta be crazy.
So just a question of what has been like a challenge or a difficulty you've had with writing, and how did you overcome it? Because each of us, I think, have things that we struggle with, and so I'd just be curious. Thank you.
Yeah, I think partly like when I had kids, I was still in my 20s. So I just like finding the time to do it. But it was again adapting. So I started writing things like where the chapters or sections are just a few thousand words. So I was able to do that in between like nap times and stuff. But I think that like rejection's a big one. Like it's just I think the first rejection I ever got is I sent a script to North by Northwest, which is a production company here in town, and they didn't ask for it. I was a 17-year-old kid, and I had their address, so I just sent the script to them. And they were like, "Hey, like, thank you for sending this. We're gonna say no. Next time, go through the proper channels if you want to submit something." I didn't see the rejection in that. I was so excited that somebody read it or even opened the envelope. And I always kind of tried to hold on to that. Because I think when you get into it, when you're getting into like 100 rejections a year, it kind of sometimes feels like nobody's actually reading what you're sending out. So I always try to go back to that very first one, where it was just the excitement of being confident enough in the work, and then knowing that somebody, even just one other person, read it. Even if they didn't like it, they still read what I made. Yeah, I think outside of those two things, it's just really the discipline of sitting down and doing it and finding something you want to write about. And I guess like the two books I wrote after Learn to Swim, they were rejected for 8 years. And I kind of got to a point where I thought like maybe I just had one book in me, and like maybe I don't have anything else, and that's okay, I guess. So I think it was on one hand trying to find a comfort or like being content with that, but also realizing that I'm not writing for anybody else if I don't want to. Like if I have a story to tell, and if it's just to me on my own computer, I need to like find the comfort in that. So.
So would you describe that as writer's block? See, I'm suffering writer's block right now, and I can't seem to get past it. What have you ever suffered from that or anything?
I don't think so. So I think like writer's block, I think it is a mental block. And I think at this point, like I'm just so busy with like family life and other stuff. And I'm always reading a book. So I feel like if I don't have anything to write about, I'll just be dumb and ignore it and forget that I don't have anything to write about. I think if I was sitting down every day and then just staring at that blank screen with the cursor blinking at me,
I used to be able to just look at things, I write children's books, and I used to be able to just look and could imagine a story or something. Now I look at things, I can't imagine anything. So I'm just going crazy. I mean, all my life I've been able to think about this.
Well, it reminds me of so it's a Taika Waititi. It's the guy who made Jojo Rabbit. So he has a quote that says, if you sit down at your computer and you write for 8 hours, that's writing. If you sit down at your computer, and you stare at a blank screen for 8 hours, that's still writing. Like you're still putting the time in. And you're still like, I don't know, I think you're just letting the experience and everything just kind of wash over you. And I think that is valuable. Like recently, I think I was overthinking things. And instead of listening to my audiobooks, I just took the dog for a walk with nothing else. And 5 minutes of the walk, not thinking about anything, the one line I was looking for just popped into my head. So I had to run back before I forgot it. Like I was chanting it to myself. Don't forget this, don't forget this. So I do think taking a break and maybe not putting as much pressure on yourself and just kind of letting it come as it comes.
What's been your favorite book in the last 5 years?
I don't know. I did just read Pet Sematary for the first time.
Oh.
And that's a devastating book, but like way, way better than I thought. Because all I know was the movie from the 80s, which is really campy and kind of bad. So I wasn't expecting the book to be as good as it was. I'm really tempted to pull my Goodreads up. Now, I think the best book I've read that immediately comes to mind it's a book called Sirens by Joshua Moore. So he was a writer that originally lived in San Francisco. I think 4 years ago he moved to Seattle, so I think he's still in the Seattle area. But he wrote this book called Sirens, and he was a drug addict and an alcoholic. So the first half of the book is all about how he was just this degenerate and just not a good person. And then he cleans himself up. He's sober, meets a new girl, gets remarried, has a kid. He's on the straight and narrow. His life is great, and then he starts having seizures. So he goes to the doctor, and they find out that he has a hole the size of a quarter in his heart. So these blood clusters going through his heart straight up to his brain. But there is a procedure that can fix this. So it's essentially putting this synthetic umbrella through one of your arteries into your heart, and you open it up, and that will save him. And he's like, this is wild. So he starts researching this procedure and finds out that a Nazi had developed it during the Holocaust. So then he's just like, he doesn't know what to do because he's thinking like, at what point are you a good person versus a bad person? Like, does his past always deem him as a bad person no matter how good he is from here on out? So it's just this really complicated, in-depth, really heartfelt, and just raw memoir. So that's the best book I've read in the last 5 years.
Cool.
Because I like things that make you feel happy.
Just upbeat all the time.
Yeah. I just like to laugh.
Nice. Oh my gosh. All right. Good. Well, thank you, sir.
No, thank you. This was great.